Before we dive into tonight's extraordinary journey between worlds, I'd like to ask you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. What you're about to hear might change how you think about life, death, and everything that lies beyond. And I promise you won't want to miss a single story like this one on our channel. Tonight, I bring you the story of Michael Thornwood, a 68-year-old former builder and master craftsman from Montana. These are his words, shared anonymously with our channel. I never used to believe in anything I couldn't touch with my hands. Spent my whole life working with tangible things, wood, stone, metal, materials that follow rules. Cut a beam too short, and no amount of wishing will make it longer. That was my truth for 68 years, until I died for 5 minutes. I lived, I should say, before everything changed, in a small cabin outside Whitefish, Montana. Nothing fancy, just a place I built with my own 2 hands after Eleanor passed. That was 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. She made it 3. After 42 years together, I found myself alone in a house full of memories we'd built together, so I left. Couldn't bear to stay in that empty home another day. My new place sits on 12 acres, mostly pine forest. In winter, it's about as isolated as you can get without completely falling off the map. My closest neighbor, Phil, lives 2 miles down the road, and he's only there on weekends. That's how I wanted it. After Eleanor, I didn't much see the point in people anymore. Every morning since moving here, I'd wake at 5:30, make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and watch the sunrise from my porch. Montana winters don't care much for human comfort, but there's a clarity in that cold. Makes everything sharp, present. By 7, I'd be splitting wood. Didn't matter that I had enough stockpile to last 3 winters. The routine kept me sane. Some folks might call it depression, this life I carved out. Maybe they'd be right, but I called it peace. The only time I felt anything close to normal was working with my hands, same as I'd done for 40 years as a builder and furniture maker. They call it muscle memory, I suppose. My body remembered how to keep going, even when my heart wasn't in it. I should mention that I've never been what you'd call a spiritual man. My generation, especially those of us who served in Vietnam, I was there from 71 to 73, we saw things that made it hard to believe in a benevolent higher power. Eleanor was the believer in our family. She'd pray every night while I pretended to sleep. After she passed, I found a Bible by our bed with my name written inside the cover. Never opened it. The only thing I kept from my father was his pocket watch. Swiss-made, silver case, mechanical movement you have to wind every day. He was a builder too, taught me everything I know about working with wood. Died of a heart attack at his workbench when I was 30. The watch stopped the moment he died, 3:27 in the afternoon. The repairman said it was just coincidence, something in the mechanism giving out. I wasn't so sure, but I kept it with me always, even though it didn't run anymore. Some connections you don't question. January 17th, 2019 started like any other day. Temperature hovering around 10 below zero. Sky clear enough to hurt your eyes if you look too long. I remember checking the weather report. Storm coming in by evening, they said. I needed to split more wood before it hit. Buck, my black lab, was watching from the porch as I worked. He'd been Eleanor's dog, really. Barely tolerated me while she was alive. But grief makes strange companions. Now he followed me everywhere, those sad brown eyes watching like he was waiting for something. I remember thinking how quiet everything was that morning. No birds, no distant traffic, just the sound of my breath forming clouds and my axe biting into pine. I'd been out there about an hour when I felt the first twinge in my chest. Nothing serious, just a tightness, like after you've carried something too heavy for too long. Just getting old, I told Buck, who tilted his head like he understood. At 68, your body starts to argue with you about the things you've always done without thinking. I ignored it and kept working. Had another hour to go before the storm front moved in. The thing about death is how ordinary the moments before it can be. No dramatic music swelling in the background, no slideshow of your life flashing before your eyes. Just 1 minute you're splitting wood on a cold Montana morning, and the next... Looking back now, there were signs. The way Buck suddenly stood at attention, ears forward, staring at something behind me that wasn't there. The unusual stillness of the air, like the world was holding its breath. The way the sunlight seemed to intensify for just a moment, casting everything in gold. I raised the axe for another swing, and that's when it hit me. Not discomfort this time. Pain. Like someone had wrapped a steel band around my chest and was tightening it with every heartbeat. The axe slipped from my hands. I remember the sound it made hitting the snow, muffled, distant, like it was happening to someone else. I think I called for help, but who would hear me? My phone was inside. Phil wouldn't be up until the weekend. As my knees buckled and I fell face first into the snow, my last thought wasn't profound. It wasn't about Eleanor or God or the big questions. It was about Buck. Who would feed him if I didn't get up? The cold snow pressed against my cheek. I could feel my heart, fluttering, uneven, trying to keep pace. Then even that sensation faded and the pain with it. My last conscious thought was reaching for my father's pocket watch in my coat pocket, feeling its familiar weight against my palm. The world went white, then black, then something else entirely. What came next would change everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what might wait for us on the other side. Michael's journey beyond the veil is just beginning. In our next segment, we'll hear about his first moments outside his physical body and the extraordinary encounters that awaited him. His testimony raises profound questions about consciousness and whether death is truly the end or just another beginning. The pain vanished. That was the first thing I noticed, not gradually, like when medication kicks in, but instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment I was in agony and the next, nothing. Absolute absence of pain. My eyes opened, at least that's how it felt, though I'm not sure eyes is the right word anymore. I was looking down at myself, face down in the snow, my right arm stretched out, fingers still curled around my father's pocket watch. Buck was pacing frantically around my body, whining and nudging my shoulder with his nose. "It's okay, boy," I said, or tried to. No sound came out. Or maybe it did, but not in any way that could reach him. I should have been terrified. A rational man would be. But fear requires a heartbeat, adrenaline, all those physical responses, and I wasn't physical anymore. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity, like waking from a lifetime of fog I hadn't even realized was there. I watched as Buck suddenly stopped pacing and looked up, his ears perked forward, eyes tracking something moving across the yard. A truck I didn't recognize, red Ford F-150, rust around the wheel wells, was pulling into my driveway. Phil's truck was blue, and he wasn't due until Saturday. The stranger parked haphazardly and ran toward my body, slipping twice on the ice. He knelt beside me, checked for a pulse, then pulled out a phone. I could hear his voice, distorted like it was coming through water. "I need an ambulance, man down, possible heart attack." I tried to tell him I was fine, better than fine, actually. But again, there was no way to communicate. It was strange watching this scene unfold, this stranger performing CPR on what used to be me, Buck barking frantically. I felt oddly detached, like watching a movie where I recognized the characters but had no emotional investment in the outcome. Stranger still was how I could see everything at once, not just the scene below, but my entire property. I could see the roof of my cabin, including a section of damaged shingles on the north side I'd never noticed before. I could see the road leading to my property, the ambulance still miles away but approaching fast. I could even see inside my cabin, where the coffee pot I'd left on was now boiling dry. I began to drift upward, not intentionally, but as if being gently pulled by an invisible current. The higher I rose, the more I could perceive. I could see Phil's weekend cabin, where he was packing his truck to come up early because of the storm forecast. I could see the small town of Whitefish in the distance, people going about their day, oblivious to what was happening to me. Time seemed different too. I watched a snowflake fall from sky to ground, observing every microscopic detail of its crystal structure. The way it tumbled and rotated in the air, what should have taken seconds, seemed to stretch into minutes or hours. Yet simultaneously I could perceive the emergency responders covering miles of road in what felt like moments. There was no cold, despite being in the Montana winter air, no discomfort of any kind. For the first time since coming back from Vietnam, maybe the first time since childhood, I felt completely at peace. As I continued to rise, my perception of my property and the surrounding area began to fade, replaced by something I can only describe as a transition zone. The physical world was still visible below me, but growing distant, like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. Above and around me was something else, not quite light, not quite mist, but a shimmering boundary between here and somewhere else. I hesitated at this threshold. Some part of me, the practical builder who'd spent a lifetime believing only in what he could measure and cut, was trying to make sense of this experience. Heart attack hallucinations, maybe. Oxygen deprivation causing the brain to fire randomly. All the rational explanations I would have clung to before. But rationality was fading with each moment, replaced by a certainty I can't explain. This was real. More real than anything I'd experienced in 68 years of living. As I crossed that threshold, the last thing I saw of the physical world was the ambulance arriving at my cabin, the paramedics rushing out with their equipment, Buck watching anxiously from the porch, the stranger who'd found me standing back, hand over his mouth. Then everything changed. The transition was both instant and gradual. Colors I've never seen before, can't even describe now, began to emerge around me. The sensation was like watching a Polaroid develop, if a Polaroid could capture feelings and not just images. Everything was becoming more vivid, more present, more true. I found myself in a place that somehow felt familiar, though I'd never seen it before. A meadow that stretched toward distant mountains, bathed in a golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The light was both brighter than anything I'd experienced on Earth, yet it didn't hurt to look at it. Instead, it felt nourishing, as if I were drawing strength just from being in its presence. The meadow was filled with wildflowers that swayed in a gentle breeze I could sense but not feel. The mountains in the distance had a clarity to them that made Earth's most spectacular vistas seem like blurry photographs in comparison. Everything was hyper-real, more defined than physical reality, yet obviously not physical at all. If you're wondering whether I'm going to tell you I saw pearly gates or angels with harps, I won't. What I experienced wasn't like any heaven I'd heard described in Sunday school as a child. It wasn't religious in any conventional sense. It was beyond that. Beyond any human construct or definition, what I can tell you is that I wasn't alone. If you've stuck with me this far in my story, don't go anywhere. What happened next changed everything I thought I understood about life, death, and the connections that bind us across all boundaries. And for those who've lost someone they love, you may find comfort in what I'm about to share. Stay with me, because in my next few moments in that golden meadow, I would discover truths about existence that no scientific instrument could ever measure and no theology could fully capture. In the distance, I saw 3 figures approaching across the meadow. Even before I could make out their features, I knew them, not with my eyes, but with something deeper, some part of me that recognized them instantly, the way you might recognize your own reflection. The first was my father, not as I last saw him, grey-haired and stooped from decades of physical labor, but as he'd been in his prime. He wore the same flannel shirt and canvas work pants he'd worn the day he first taught me to use a hand plane, showing me how to read the grain of the wood, how to feel the right angle by instinct rather than measurement. His hands were strong and steady, unmarked by the arthritis that had gnarled them in his later years. Behind him trotted Rusty, my childhood dog, a copper-colored retriever who'd been my constant shadow from ages 8 to 18. He died while I was away at college, my first real experience with grief. He bounded toward me with the same energy he'd had as a young dog, his entire body wagging with joy. And then there was Tommy, my younger brother, frozen forever at 21, wearing his marine dress uniform just as he had in the last photo we received before the telegram arrived. Tommy, who'd stepped on a landmine 2 years before I shipped out to the same godforsaken jungle. Tommy, whose death had been the first crack in our parents' marriage, a wound that never fully healed. They approached without seeming to walk, covering the distance between us in a way that defied physics. One moment they were far away, the next they were standing before me. "Been a while, son," my father said, though his lips didn't move. The words simply formed in my mind, carrying all the warmth and gruff affection I remembered. I tried to speak, found I didn't need to. My thoughts reached out to them directly. I couldn't finish the question. Tommy smiled, that crooked smile that had always gotten him out of trouble as a kid. "Not exactly, Mike. Not permanently, anyway." Rusty pushed his head under my hand. I could feel his fur, actually feel it, soft and warm just as it had been in life. How was that possible without a physical body, without physical hands? "You've got questions," my father said. "Everyone does. But time works differently here. You'll understand more than I could ever explain, just by being here." I looked around, taking in the impossible beauty of this place again. "So this is heaven?" I asked. My father chuckled, the same low rumble I remembered from childhood. "Labels don't work too well here. It's not exactly what you were taught, but it's not exactly not that either." "Your Eleanor isn't here," Tommy said, answering the question before I could form it. "She's waiting, but elsewhere. It's not your time to see her yet." A pang of disappointment shot through me, the first negative emotion I'd felt since arriving. "Why not?" Instead of answering directly, my father gestured, and suddenly we weren't standing in the meadow anymore. We were everywhere I'd ever been, and places I'd never seen. Moments from my life flashed around us, not in sequence, but simultaneously, as if all time was happening at once. I saw myself as a child, learning to cut dovetail joints in my father's workshop. I saw myself in Vietnam, terrified and trying not to show it. I saw my wedding day, Eleanor radiant in a simple white dress she'd made herself. I saw the birth of our daughter, Sarah. The day she left for college, the day she told us she was cutting contact, that she needed to find herself without our expectations weighing her down. I saw all the houses and furniture I'd built over 40 years, the people who lived in those spaces, the lives that unfolded within walls I'd raised. Some were happy, some troubled, but all were connected to me in ways I'd never realized. Most surprisingly, I saw small moments I'd forgotten. Helping a stranded motorist change a tire during a snowstorm, anonymously paying for a young family's dinner at the local diner when I overheard them worrying about money, building a wheelchair ramp for an elderly neighbor and refusing payment. "You see," my father said, "it all matters, every bit of it, especially the parts you thought no one saw." The cascade of images slowed, focusing on one in particular. A teenage boy I didn't recognize, working on a wooden birdhouse in what looked like a high school shop class. He was using techniques I recognized. My techniques. "Who is that?" I asked. "Your grandson," Tommy said. "Sarah's boy. You haven't met him yet. She named him Michael." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "Sarah has a son. Why didn't she tell me?" Pride, my father said simply, on both sides, but he needs you, Mike. He has your hands, your eye. He needs what only you can teach him. The images shifted again, showing Sarah older than when I'd last seen her, standing on my cabin porch, holding a photograph. Her face was lined with an uncertainty I recognized, the same expression she'd worn as a child when she knew she'd made a mistake, but didn't know how to fix it. "There's more for you to do," Tommy said. "Your story isn't finished." Before I could respond, something changed in the quality of light around us. A subtle dimming, a distant pull. My father looked up sharply. "They're bringing you back," he said. There was no judgment in his voice, just statement of fact. "I don't want to go back," I said, suddenly certain. "There's nothing for me there, just an empty house and memories." My father placed his hand on my shoulder. I could feel the calluses, the strength that had always made me feel safe as a child. "That's not true, son. You just haven't seen it yet. But you will." Tommy stepped forward. "We'll be here. Time doesn't work the same. To us, it will be like you never left." Rusty whined softly, pushing against my leg one last time. The pull was stronger now, insistent. The golden light began to fade, the meadow growing transparent around us. I could hear something in the distance, mechanical beeping, urgent voices, a high-pitched whine that hurt in a way nothing had hurt since arriving in this place. "Wait," I said desperately. "What about Eleanor? Why isn't she here?" My father's face softened. "She made me promise to tell you. She's waiting for you, but not yet. When it's truly time, she'll be the first one you see." The last thing I remember was my father pointing to something in the distance. Following his gesture, I saw a figure far away, too far to make out clearly. A woman in a simple white dress, her hand raised in what might have been a wave, or a blessing, or a promise. Then everything, the meadow, my father, Tommy, Rusty, the distant silhouette of Eleanor, dissolved into light. The pain came rushing back, along with the cold and the sound of someone shouting, "We've got a rhythm, we've got him back." I didn't want to be back. For the first time in my 68 years, I had been completely at peace, and they had ripped me away from it. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be resuscitated after cardiac arrest, let me tell you, it's excruciating. Every nerve suddenly remembering how to feel pain, lungs burning as they're forced to inhale, the brutal compression of CPR cracking ribs. My return to life was not the peaceful awakening you see in movies. It was violent, jarring, and unwelcome. My first conscious thought was anger, pure blinding rage at being pulled away from that golden meadow, from my family, from the peace I'd found there. I wanted to tell the paramedics to stop, to let me go back, but I couldn't speak through the oxygen mask they'd strapped to my face. I caught fragments of their conversation as they loaded me into the ambulance. Full cardiac arrest, down for approximately 5 minutes. Lucky that guy found him when he did. 5 minutes. It had felt like both an eternity and a single moment. How could everything I'd experienced fit into just 5 minutes of earthly time? As the ambulance doors closed and the siren wailed to life, I felt something in my right hand. My father's pocket watch still clutched in my grip. With tremendous effort, I managed to open my fingers enough to look at it. The watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 10:17 a.m., the exact moment of my death. But that wasn't possible. The watch hadn't run in decades. I tried to show it to one of the paramedics, but he misunderstood, gently removing it from my hand and placing it in a plastic bag with my other personal effects. "Don't worry, sir," he said, patting my shoulder. "We'll make sure you get everything back at the hospital." I wanted to explain that he didn't understand. This was important, this was proof. But darkness was closing in again. Not the peaceful transition I'd experienced before, but the heavy blanket of unconsciousness that comes with trauma and medication. The last thing I remember before passing out was one of the paramedics saying to another, "Weird. This old watch just started ticking again. If what I've shared so far has touched something in you, whether you're a believer or a skeptic, don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or questions. Many who've experienced what I did keep silent, afraid of judgment or disbelief. Your engagement lets others know they're not alone in their experiences or curiosity about what lies beyond. I woke up in the intensive care unit of North Valley Hospital. The steady beep of monitors, the antiseptic smell, the fluorescent lighting, everything felt harsh and abrasive after where I'd been. A nurse noticed I was awake and smiled professionally. "Welcome back, Mr. Thornwood. You gave us quite a scare." I tried to speak, found my throat raw from intubation. She offered ice chips, which felt like shards of glass going down. "What happened?" I managed to ask, though I knew perfectly well. "Massive myocardial infarction. Heart attack," she said. "You're very lucky. If Mr. Kendrick hadn't found you when he did, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Kendrick, the man in the red truck. How did he find me? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Distant and unfamiliar. "He said he was making a delivery to a property up the road and took a wrong turn. Pure chance." She adjusted something on my IV. "The doctor will be in soon to explain everything." Pure chance. The words echoed in my mind, but I knew better now. Nothing was chance. Nothing was random. Everything was connected in ways I was only beginning to understand. The cardiologist, Dr. Phillips, arrived an hour later. Middle-aged woman with prematurely grey hair and eyes that had seen too many deaths. She explained my condition with clinical precision. Complete blockage of the left anterior descending artery. The widowmaker, they call it. Significant damage to the heart muscle. I would need medication, lifestyle changes, possibly more procedures down the line. "You were clinically dead for approximately 5 minutes, Mr. Thornwood," she said, watching my reaction carefully. "Do you remember anything from that time?" I hesitated. In my experience, doctors didn't want to hear about golden meadows and visits with deceased relatives. They wanted vital signs and quantifiable data. "No," I lied. "Nothing." She nodded, unsurprised. "That's normal. The brain typically doesn't form memories during cardiac arrest." But as she turned to leave, something compelled me to speak. "Doctor, there was a red truck. A Ford F-150 with rust around the wheel wells. The man who found me, he performed CPR before the ambulance arrived." "Doctor..." Phillips paused at the door. "That's right. How did you know that detail? You were unconscious when he found you." "I saw it," I said simply. She frowned slightly. "Perhaps the paramedics mentioned it. There's also damage to the north side of my roof. Shingles missing, and my coffee pot was left on. It's probably ruined by now." Her expression changed, professional distance giving way to genuine curiosity. "Mr. Thornwood, are you saying you had some kind of out-of-body experience?" "I'm saying I saw things I couldn't possibly have seen if I was just lying face down in the snow." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've heard similar accounts from other cardiac arrest survivors. It's not uncommon." Her tone was carefully neutral. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." But I could tell she'd categorized me, another patient with anoxic hallucinations, another data point for her scientific understanding of near-death experiences. She hadn't dismissed me outright, which was something, but she hadn't really heard me either. I spent 3 days in the ICU before they moved me to a regular room. Phil came to visit, brought news that Buck was being well cared for at his place. The man who found me, Jim Kendrick, stopped by briefly. Turned out he was a new delivery driver who'd misread his GPS. Wrong place, right time. I wanted to tell him what his wrong turn had meant. Not just that he'd saved my life, but that he'd interrupted something profound. But how do you explain that to a stranger? How do you tell someone you're not entirely grateful they saved you? On my 5th day in the hospital, a young social worker named Rachel came to discuss my transition plan. With my heart function compromised, living alone in a remote cabin was deemed unsafe. She suggested assisted living facilities, home healthcare options, possibly moving closer to family. "I don't have family," I told her. "Not anymore." She consulted her tablet. "Your records indicate a daughter in Seattle. Sarah Thornwood Green?" The surname was unfamiliar. She must have married. "We haven't spoken in 8 years. Rachel's expression softened. "Would you like us to contact her? In situations like this, many families—" "No," I interrupted, then surprised myself by reconsidering. "Actually, yes. Tell her what happened if you think you should. But make it clear I'm not asking for anything." After she left, I found myself staring at the ceiling, thinking about what I'd seen in that otherworldly vision. Sarah with a son, my grandson. A boy named Michael, who apparently had my hands, my aptitude for woodworking. Was it real, or just my dying brain manufacturing a comforting fantasy? There was one way to find out. The next day, Dr. Phillips cleared me for discharge, though with a laundry list of restrictions and follow-up appointments. Phil offered to drive me home and stay for a few days to help out. I was gathering my belongings when a nurse entered with a curious expression. "Mr. Thornwood, you have a visitor." Standing in the doorway was a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair streaked with premature grey, just like her mother's had been. Her face was thinner than I remembered, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 8 years ago. Behind her, partially hidden, was a boy of about 13, lanky and awkward in that way of teenagers who haven't grown into their bodies yet. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely audible. "Dad." She stepped into the room hesitantly. "They called and said you had a heart attack." I did. What else could I say? That I'd died, that I'd seen her grandfather and uncle in some otherworldly meadow, that I knew about her son before I'd even seen him. "This is Michael," she said, gently nudging the boy forward. "Your grandson." The boy looked up and I saw my father's eyes looking back at me, the same deep-set blue eyes that had watched me learn to plane wood 6 decades earlier. "Hey," he said, with the typical teenage economy of expression. "Hey yourself," I replied, fighting a sudden tightness in my throat that had nothing to do with intubation. Sarah filled the awkward silence. "We've been living in Seattle. I'm teaching elementary school. Michael's in 8th grade. She hesitated. "I should have called, before, I mean, years ago." "Yes," I agreed, "you should have, and I should have reached out too." Another silence fell. 8 years of distance isn't bridged in a moment, no matter what revelations you've had on the other side. "Mom said you build stuff," Michael finally said, "like houses and furniture and things." "I did. Not so much anymore." "Michael's been taking woodshop at school," Sarah offered. "He's quite good at it." The boy shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "It's just a birdhouse." A birdhouse, just like in my vision. "Do you have anywhere to stay?" I asked them. "Besides a motel, I mean." Sarah shook her head. "We drove straight up when we got the call. Didn't really think beyond getting here. My place is small, but there's room." I looked at Phil, who'd been waiting quietly by the door. "If you don't mind sharing the couch with Buck." Phil raised his hands. "Actually, I was going to suggest Sarah and the boy take my guest room. I'm just down the road, and it's a bit more comfortable than your cabin, Mike." It was decided then. Sarah and Michael would stay at Phil's for a few days. We'd take it from there, see what happened. No promises, no expectations. As they turned to leave, I remembered something. "Sarah, wait." I reached for the plastic bag containing my personal effects and pulled out my father's pocket watch. "Take this and look at it closely." She took it, turning the old silver case in her hands. "Grandpa's watch? The one that stopped working when he died?" "Look at it," I insisted. "Really look." Her eyes widened as she realized. It's ticking. How is that possible? You said it hadn't worked since the day he died, I finished. It started running again the day I died, and came back. Sarah stared at me, then at the watch, confusion evident on her face. Dad, what are you saying? I'm saying there are things I need to tell you, things that might sound crazy, but they're true. About your grandfather, about your Uncle Tommy, about what happens when we leave this life. The skepticism in her expression was familiar. It was the same look I'd worn for 68 years. Just keep an open mind, I said, not pushing further. We've got time. 3 days later, I was back in my cabin. The coffee pot had indeed boiled dry, just as I'd seen during my out-of-body experience. Phil confirmed the damaged shingles on the north side of the roof, impossible to see from the ground where I'd fallen. Sarah and Michael visited daily. Our conversations were cautious at first, circling around the 8-year void between us. I learned she'd divorced 3 years ago, that Michael's father wasn't in the picture, that they'd been struggling financially despite her teaching job. I didn't press about the woodworking. Some connections can't be forced. They have to develop on their own. But on their 4th visit, Michael asked if he could see my workshop. The small outbuilding behind the cabin had been my sanctuary since moving to Montana. Eleanor had called it my hermit cave. It was nothing special, just a converted shed with proper insulation, a wood stove, and the tools I'd collected over a lifetime. But walking into it with my grandson felt like coming full circle. Whoa, Michael said, running his hand over a half-finished walnut table. You made this? Started it last summer, I said. Haven't had the motivation to finish it. He moved around the shop, examining tools with a reverence that made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with my damaged heart. He stopped at the lathe, watching me questioningly. Ever turned wood before? I asked. He shook his head. Want to learn? The smile that spread across his face was answer enough. I found a piece of maple burl I'd been saving, showed him how to mount it, how to hold the turning tools properly. The wood will tell you what it wants to be, I told him, echoing what my father had told me decades ago. Your job is to listen with your hands. For 2 hours, we worked together. His first attempt was rough, uneven, nothing like the mental image he'd had. I could see his frustration building. My grandpa, your great-grandfather, used to say something about mistakes in woodworking, I said. Want to know what it was? Michael nodded, still frowning at his lopsided creation. He said, there are no mistakes, only design changes. I picked up the piece he'd been ready to discard. This isn't what you planned, but it's still something. Maybe even something better. After they left that evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Buck lying at my feet. The pain in my chest was a constant reminder of how fragile this existence is, how quickly it can end. But for the first time since Eleanor died, maybe for the first time since Vietnam, I felt something like purpose returning. That night, I dreamed of the meadow again. My father was there, sitting on a bench he'd built for our family home when I was a child. You're doing good, son, he said, though again his lips didn't move. I'm trying, I replied. It's not easy. Never said it would be, he smiled, but worth it. I woke with tears on my face and a certainty that went bone deep. What I'd experienced wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my dying brain manufacturing comforting images. It was real as the wood I worked with, as real as the grandson now back in my life. Over the next weeks, Sarah and Michael became regular fixtures at my cabin. We talked about moving the coffee table project to Phil's garage, where there'd be more room for all 3 of us to work. Michael soaked up every technique I showed him, making the same mistakes I'd made at his age, asking the same questions I'd once asked my father. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on the porch watching Michael throw sticks for Buck, she finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. What really happened when your heart stopped, Dad? And don't tell me nothing again. I took a deep breath and told her everything. The out-of-body experience. Seeing the red truck arrive, floating above my property, the meadow, meeting her grandfather and uncle, the life review, seeing her and Michael in my vision before I'd known he existed. I expected disbelief, maybe even concern about my mental state. Instead, she listened quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Mom used to talk about something similar," she finally said, "before she died. She said she'd had dreams where Grandpa came to her, told her everything would be okay." She wiped her eyes. "I thought it was the medication or just wishful thinking." "It wasn't," I said with certainty. She was getting glimpses of what was waiting for her. For all of us. Sarah looked out at Michael, now sitting in the grass with Buck's head in his lap. "She told me something else too, right at the end. She said, 'When it's time, I'll be waiting for your father, but not yet. He has more to do.'" The exact words my father had spoken in my vision. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked. "Would you have believed me?" She gave me a sad smile. "You were always the practical one, Dad, the one who needed proof." I held up my father's pocket watch, still ticking after decades of silence. "I've got my proof now." 2 months after my heart attack, Sarah and Michael moved in with me. We converted the rarely used second bedroom into a space for him, and Sarah took the main bedroom while I settled into a comfortable sofa bed in the living room. It wasn't ideal, but it was temporary. We'd already started drawing up plans to build an addition to the cabin. The doctors were amazed by my recovery. Dr. Phillips, during one of my follow-up visits, finally asked directly about what I'd experienced. "I've been practicing cardiology for 20 years, she said. "I've had hundreds of patients code and come back. Many report experiences similar to yours." She hesitated. I used to dismiss them as anoxic hallucinations, but then I had a patient accurately describe conversations that happened 30 feet down the hall while she was clinically dead. "What do you think now?" I asked. She shook her head slightly. "I think there's more to consciousness than we understand. More to everything, really." "That's a start," I told her. "That's a very good start." On weekends, Michael and I worked in the shop, while Sarah graded papers or prepared lessons for her new teaching position at the local elementary school. I showed him everything my father had taught me, plus techniques I'd developed over 40 years of working with wood. The kid had a natural talent, better than mine if I'm honest. He could read grain direction instinctively, knew exactly how much pressure to apply to a hand plane, developed a feel for when wood was ready to take a finish. One Saturday, as we put the finishing touches on a set of kitchen chairs, he asked, "Do you think this is why you came back? To teach me this stuff?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Mom told me about your experience, about seeing your dad and brother." He ran his hand over the smooth maple surface we'd just finished. "She said they told you it wasn't your time yet, that you had more to do." "Your mother talks too much," I said, but there was no heat in it. "So was it for this?" He gestured at the workshop around us. "To teach me?" I considered the question carefully. "I think it's more than that. I think it's about connections, the ones we make, the ones we lose, the ones we rediscover." I picked up my father's pocket watch from where it sat on my workbench. "My father taught me. Now I'm teaching you. Someday you might teach your own child." "But it's more than just woodworking," Michael pressed. "Isn't it?" "Smart kid. Too smart sometimes." "Yes," I admitted. "It's about understanding that nothing truly ends, not if we carry it forward, not if we remember." He nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. After a moment he said, "I wish I could have met Great-Grandpa, and Great-Grandma too." "You will," I told him with absolute certainty. "Not for a long, long time, I hope, but someday." That night I found myself sitting on the porch long after Sarah and Michael had gone to bed. The Montana sky was clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Buck lay at my feet, content just to be near. The events of the past month still felt surreal at times. My death and return, Sarah and Michael coming back into my life. The way my father's watch had mysteriously started ticking again, yet underneath the strangeness was a profound simplicity. Love continues. Beyond death, beyond time, beyond all the boundaries we think are permanent. I pulled out my father's pocket watch and opened it, watching the second hand sweep smoothly around the face. In the moonlight, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A tiny inscription inside the case, worn nearly smooth with age. I tilted it toward the porch light to make out the faded words. Time is nothing. Love is everything. I don't know if my father had put those words there, or if they'd been there all along, waiting for me to notice at exactly the right moment. But sitting there under the vast Montana sky, I finally understood what my experience had been trying to show me. We're not just physical beings having an occasional spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a temporary physical experience. Every connection we make, every life we touch, every piece of beauty we create, it all continues, rippling outward in ways we can't begin to comprehend from this side. My heart may be damaged, but it's stronger in the ways that truly matter. And when it's finally time for it to stop for good, I know who will be waiting for me in that golden meadow. But not yet. I've still got a grandson to teach, a daughter to reconnect with, and maybe a few more beautiful things to create before my time here is done. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my admittedly imperfect heart. These experiences are difficult to share, difficult to put into words that do them justice. But if something in my journey has resonated with you, if it's brought you comfort, or even just made you wonder, then I'm grateful our paths have crossed, even if only through this screen. Remember, the connections we make are the only things that truly last. So make them count, make them beautiful, and know that nothing, not even death, can break the bonds of love we forge in this life. And if you've had an experience similar to mine, don't be afraid to share it in the comments below. There are more of us than you might think, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.